Welcome to this second evening of COSAC. Tonight is a free and public conversation, a conversation between Christina Smith and Ian Harper. I won't introduce either Christina or Ian. We'll go straight to their interview now. And following the interview, Christina will field your questions. So in order to ask questions of Ian, you'll need to use the chat box on YouTube. Type your questions into the chat box on YouTube, and we will field those questions to Ian after the interview. Now, if I can get my technical things working right, I'll now turn you over to the interview.
My name is Christina Smith, and I am delighted to be interviewing Professor Ian Harper on whether economics has anything hopeful to say on the topic of climate change. Ian is currently the Dean and Director of the Melbourne Business School and also a Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics at Melbourne University. He's also a member of the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia. During his 40-year career so far, he's done some great work with governments and banks and corporations. But rather than summarize all of that, I thought I'd let you all know that actually in this year, 2020, he was appointed an officer of the Order of Australia for his distinguished service to education in the field of economics and to public and monetary policy development and reform. So congratulations, Ian.
Well, thank you, Christina. That's very kind.
Is there anything you wanted to add, or should we jump in?
No, I think that's enough. We can jump straight into the topic.
So I wanted to start by asking, isn't economics, with its emphasis on material consumption and economic growth, part of the climate change problem rather than a part of the solution?
I think it's a great place to start, Christina, because many people think that, and they think that, you know, economic growth is a source of the problem, and therefore what we need to do to deal with climate change is actually to wind back economic growth, either with a stationary state of some form or even shrinking, right? Getting smaller. Let me wind back from that, though, and point out that it certainly is true that economic growth that we've experienced over the last 200 years has been energy intensive. And it's the energy intensity of that growth which has been responsible for lifting living standards beyond really the wildest imaginings of somebody, for example, who was living in the 17th century, let alone earlier than that. So what we discovered, essentially, of course, through science and innovation, was how to release stored energy, particularly in the form of fossil fuel, obviously coal, on a scale that had never been experienced before. Clearly, humanity had learned how to release stored energy through fire by burning predominantly wood or animal dung or leaves or whatever. That was, if you like, the start of discovering how we could use fossil fuels to assist us. And I might point out that what that enabled human beings to do was, of course, to cook meat, to kill off pathogens and things of this sort. So it began the process of improving human life just right at that very outset. And then in the meantime, we'd all obviously discovered how to use other forms of energy to improve our living standards. So, for example, the animal husbandry, the use of animals for motive power, helped us to develop farming, which in turn raised the amount of consumption that we could have per capita. And then on the way through there, we had transitions to the use of wind power, the use of falling water, right? And then, of course, fossil fuels, and in much more recent times, things like nuclear energy. Now, at each stage of that game, Christina, what has happened is that we as human beings have been able to capture and release energy, generally speaking, right? Energy stored from the sun, but not exclusively. Obviously, hydroelectric power doesn't fall into that category, nor nuclear power, but any fossil fuel falls into that category. To release that energy That energy is an input to production. It enables us to increase consumption per capita, which ultimately, of course, is what we experience today, right? Much higher levels of consumption per capita. And when I say consumption, I don't just mean things that people would regard as useless trinkets. I'm talking about calories, right? The quality of food, medical care, services, environmental goods, and all sorts of things, clean air. Right? They are all, if you like, facilitated by the release of energy. So when people say, oh, well, yes, but economic growth is part of the problem, most economists would then react in the following way and say, well, if you mean that that economic growth, modern economic growth, is fueled by predominantly the burning of fossil fuels and therefore the release of carbon, right? Yes, okay, then those two things are clearly correlated. So we wouldn't be in the situation were it not for burning so much carbon. Well, you wouldn't have anthropogenic climate change, okay? I mean, nature burns carbon too, right? And there's volcanic gases and such like. I'm not a scientist, but if you want to say, well, the contribution that human beings make to anthropogenic climate change, to climate change, is through the burning of fossil fuels, and that is essentially associated with economic growth. That's correct, right? But the other side of the coin, Christina, is that same economic growth, fueled predominantly through the release of energy, right, has facilitated massive improvements in consumption per head, which of course has fed back into modern science, innovation and technology. And those very same things, right, are enabling us to manage the decarbonisation of the economy. They give us choices. To be very stark about it, people whose level of consumption is so basic that they're essentially subsisting, and they heat their huts and they cook their food by burning wood or animal dung, right? People at that low level of economic subsistence don't have the sorts of choices that high energy societies do. So yeah, sure, we could continue to burn fossil fuels and make a much greater contribution at scale because of how much we burn. But we also have the choices because of the wealth that generates, the material consumption that produces, the excess calories, if you like, that delivers. We can use that to engage our brains, right? And to innovate and invent and discover new ways of producing the same energy in ways that don't release as much carbon. And that's precisely where we are. So my view is that economics is both, if you like, part of the problem, right? Because it's economic growth that has delivered the release of carbon into the atmosphere as a byproduct of our high energy living standards. And it's also part of the solution because that same thing is what facilitates the innovation. And I might add, the innovation which has moved or it has essentially explained each energy transition that humanity has made throughout history. So it was an innovative, I don't know what it was that enabled the first humanid or whoever it was to discover how to make, strike two flints together and produce a flame. I mean, I don't know what but that was an innovative thing to do. And then, of course, to go on through the rest that I've described, farming animals, human motive power, wind, and then finally to release fossil fuels and nuclear power and so forth. At each point, that has involved the engagement of human intellect with the material world in order to release consumption.
So if I can just sort of summarize from my understanding, the high energy consumption society means that we have extra time and energy to input into using our intellect as a society to innovate technologically.
That's right.
And therefore economics fueled by fossil fuels maybe could be fueled, and economic growth could be fueled by something else that's not a fossil fuel. Yeah,
that's precisely right. I mean, but let me point out that what you just said was true of the agricultural revolution. Right? So when human beings decided that they could husband animals and keep them in a place, right? And rather than foraging for crops, they could actually grow crops in a place and begin to interbreed with the grains and all of that, and become settled. Okay, but that process, that innovation, involved the use of releasing more energy, clearly using animals, and feeding the animals with crops which you grew, right? So that was renewable. It was a renewable process for the most part. But what it did was to allow human beings exactly to have more time to start to think and to paint, right, on walls and dream large. So most anthropologists and historians, let alone economic historians, would look to the agricultural revolution, right, as the first occasion when we did what you just said. We had time to sort of think, right? And then each of these energy transitions has moved us further along. There's a bit of a chicken and egg that goes on here, which leads to which, and that I might add as a point which is argued at great length, by economic historians as to whether, why it was in Britain, why it was with, the spinning jenny and the steam engine and people like Stevenson and Watt and so forth. Was there something in the water? Was it just a sheer coincidence? Did it feed back, that they encouraged one another? Why was it at that particular time? All those things are argued at great length. But what is not argued is that the discovery of how to convert stored energy in the form of fossil fuels and release it to facilitate, in that instance, the factory revolution, right? And increase output per head and consumption per head, and giving people even more time to think and do other things, that is generally speaking not contested. So yeah, the search is on, if you like, to decarbonize, right? To find, as you put it, an alternative source for the high energy society that we live in. And if people, while we're on that subject, if they say, well, no, that's not the answer. The answer is to go back to low energy, right? Well, of course, it doesn't take too much imagination to work out what you're actually condemning people to when you go back that way. And you don't have to, you don't have to conduct a thought experiment. Just go and visit people who live in low energy societies, and you'll see what that means in terms of, obviously, consumption per head, but the sort of thing that people would care about. The death of women in childbirth, the death of children, the prevalence of disease, and the opportunities for people, particularly women, girls, who have every human potential, the same human potential that a young child would have here. And what life holds for them, right, in a low energy society compared to the opportunities that would be available to a young female.
No,
just to take that example.
I completely agree with you. I think that families, people, societies choose high energy life wherever it is a choice to do so. I think what I haven't fully got my head around is that whether we actually see the technological advances in high energy societies, if I use this dichotomy of low energy and high energy, knowing that full well that there's a spectrum.
There's a spectrum, yeah.
Currently and in history.
Yes.
But if I just sit with the dichotomy for now,
yes.
High energy environment societies have the excess to be able to innovate. Have we seen an actual history of high energy societies sharing that innovation to the benefit of low energy societies?
Well, you remember the Millennium Development Goals, right? That were set by the World Bank, right, for the year 2000. Well, basically, they had to develop a whole bunch of new ones for the year 2015, because the bulk of those, and these refer to things like raising incomes of people who are on a $1 a day, reducing the incidence of female death in childbirth, reducing the incidence of infant mortality, clean running water, that list. Well, essentially, all of those things had been ticked off by 2000. I mean, in the way they were stated. I'm not saying that poverty has been eliminated, but the way they were stated. So they had to be rejigged to lift the bar a bit, right? And if you say to yourself, to answer your question, well, I mean, where did that come from? I mean, how did that happen? The answer is primarily, of course, through the development of China, the economic development of China, which lifted out of grinding poverty, not tens of millions, but well, and not even hundreds of millions, actually a billion. And the same sort of thing has been happening in India as well. So if you can release those heavily populated nations from the lowest levels of subsistence further up that scale, well, of course, you carry the average with you, which isn't to say that there aren't pockets of desperate poverty in the world. I'm not saying that. I'm answering your question about, oh yeah, well, hasn't this just been the rich world helping itself and the poor world has been left behind? Well, the evidence is against that. Between countries, right? The evidence is that economic growth has actually lifted all the boats, not by the same amount, but it's lifted all the boats, right? Okay. Within countries, that's more complex. So when people rightly, wonder about what's happening with poverty in the United States or even in Australia for that matter, that's a more complex question. But at that very broad macro level, does economic growth, does a transition to high energy societies lift people out of lives, as Thomas Hobbes described, which are nasty, brutish and short, right? Well, the answer basically is yes, and we've got 200 years worth of evidence to show that. I don't know that people necessarily contest that one so much as to say, well, that's all very well, but we can't sustain this. Right? It's not environmentally sustainable. We just can't continue to burn fossil fuels. That's what leads us into climate change and the disasters that come from there. So that's the argument.
What hope do you have then that these innovations that would help us to decarbonize will actually materialize in time to prevent us seeing the worst of the predicted climate change scenarios?
Well, I think two answers to that, right? The first is that you would, in making any prediction about the future, look to history. And so you'd say things like, this isn't the first time that people have had very dire, cataclysmic predictions about where the world might end up. And in particular, the modern environmental movement owes an awful lot to a man called Thomas Malthus, who was, of all things, an Anglican minister. But Malthus in the early 19th century, of course, predicted that the world would basically starve to death because too many people were being born, and that would drive wages down and, if you like, consumption per head continue to fall as more and more mouths to feed. And eventually that consumption per capita would fall below the subsistence level and there would be mass starvation. Now, he took that very seriously, and a lot of people did, and that gave rise to the eugenics movement and all sorts of things, right, to deal with that, which people nowadays would find very distasteful. But what Malthus didn't take into account was innovation, the very thing you're pointing to. So when you say to me, yes, but how can you be so sure? Well, I can't, but I look at each of these historical episodes and I see, but it's remarkable, isn't it, Christina, that sort of, the cavalry arrived just in time? Well, yes, but they might not arrive again this time. Well, it's possible, isn't it, that they might not arrive? Well, what confidence do I have that they will? Well, the answer to that is about economic incentives. So what was it that prevented the Malthusian dystopia from actually being realized? Was basically the Industrial Revolution, right? And the enormous increase in output per head, in consumption per head, which actually increased the population even more. Right? So there were more people on the Malthusian logic. Well, they're all starving. No, the opposite was true. Well, how can this be? Because consumption per head went up much faster as a result of aggregate consumption rising through the use of energy, notwithstanding the increase in population. In fact, it facilitated that, which would have just been, completely outside the Malthusian calculus. So history, I look to history. We've made these transitions before. This is no doubt the toughest one. It's the largest scale, right? Okay. And I'm not enough of a scientist to be able to take people through all of the scientific sort of technical revolutions that are available. But people in this field who are specialists, including scientists, not just environmental economists, say, yes, but the technology is there. We can make these things work. That's not the problem. The problem is getting the economic incentives right, to actually produce this outcome. Well, when you're in that territory, well, that gives me a whole lot more confidence If you said to me, yes, but the technical solution doesn't exist, Ian, well, I'm at sea, I'm not a scientist. But if you say to me, and I'm just quoting other specialists, to say, no, that's not the problem, right? The actual technology exists. We know how to do this. We know how to reduce, well, obviously, one obvious answer, Christina, is nuclear power. And then people say, oh, yes, but that's too dangerous. Well, yeah, but there's, talk to a nuclear scientist. There's a whole lot of things that have changed. We're not talking about old style, large-scale nucleare. But you don't even have to do that.
On that point, as a child in South Africa, I took a field trip to a nuclear power plant on the edge of the Cape Town, and that nuclear power plant has until very recently powered most of the Cape Town region. So I'm with you on this feeling that nuclear is actually a lot safer than it's made out to be.
Well, there is an argument to be had there, but what is not arguable is that nuclear power is fossil fuel free. Right? And there are no carbon emissions. There might be, Roentgen emissions, but there are no carbon emissions from that. So when you're on the territory of saying, well, the answer really is about getting the economic incentives right? Putting taxes in place, subsidies in place to induce changes of choices of behaviour. If you're saying that's what the answer is, well, then you're right on my ground. And there I say, well, now there's at least 200 years worth of economics that will prove to you that incentives work, right? People will change their behaviour as you alter the incentives. Well, how do you get those incentives changed? That's a politico-economic problem. Well, we're way away from the technical issues. And one final little example there's a wonderful book that I'd really recommend people have a look at by a man called Vaclav Smil, unusual name. He's a Czech, and he has the distinction of being the person. He's Bill Gates's number one fan. That is to say, yeah, he is Bill Gates is his number one fan. Get around the right way. Bill Gates says that he waits for new books from Vaclav Smil like other people wait for new Star Wars movies. Anyway, Smil wrote a book recently called Energy and Civilization, A History. And it goes through in great detail the sort of transitions we've been talking about, Christina. But it's full of all sorts of interesting facts. One of them is this, which is part of the reason why I have confidence. Right? He points out that a light-emitting diode, right? A light-emitting diode is 50,000% more efficient than burning a candle, right, at producing light. So if you look at, lumens per watt, okay, then a light-emitting diode is 50,000% more efficient, more energy efficient. So you get, for the same amount of light, 50,000% less power use, or the other way around. Right? And furthermore, that the light-emitting diode is only about, a quarter of the way along the spectrum of the potential for efficiency gains in the production of light. There's an upper limit because the human eye basically can't see any brighter than, I think it's 680 lumens or something, right? And a light-emitting diode will produce about 150 lumens. So you're about a quarter of the way. And so the sort of innovation that we've experienced will just continue to drive the energy use of something like a light-emitting diode further and further down. And people who say, the answer is to go back to burning candles, you see, that's where the logic is false. Whether you're burning candles or whether you're burning dung or wood or whatever, it is the environmental destruction that would occur if we decided to go back that way, right, is just sort of unthinkable in terms of the impact on human welfare. The other point that Smil makes in this book, and this is also, I think, very hopeful and encouraging, right, is that he says that that the human brain, right, burns as much energy, which is drawn, of course, from food, right, essentially stored energy from the sun coming to us in the form of vegetable and meat that we eat, right? So metabolic energy. The human brain burns as much metabolic energy dreaming up a brilliant, innovative new idea as it does from staring blankly at the wall. So you think about that. So then he says, so the answer is not more food. Right? We don't have to feed people more to deliver these innovations. Where do they come from? Well, they're dreamt up by the human brain and dreamt up on the same, with using the same metabolic energy as if you were just staring blankly at the wall. Well, how do you get the human brain to go from one to the other? Right? Now, clearly there's a deep answer there, but one answer that he gives is that that's where human interaction comes in. Right? What happens is we gather together in originally troops, then tribes, then villages, now cities, call them what you like. Large groups of human beings, we get together and we basically stir each other up, right? Stimulate each other to new ideas through events like we are now presently in. Conversations where somebody says, no, that's not right, right? And then thinks, actually, wait a minute, right? If we did this, da-da-da-da, right? So what Smil is sort of saying, there is your hope. The hope is that, and as Christians, we might say, that's the spark, that's the gift of the Holy Spirit in us. And one of the gifts is this intellect, right? But that we spark off each other and create these ideas. And in each of these transitions that we've been through, where we've got obviously more recent history, we can actually name names, but if you go right the way back, these innovations are shared. They're the result of somebody coming up with doing something differently, somebody else then building on that, and then, converting that. Some of these ideas die in the ditch, other ones then modified, and away we go. But what you're doing is using basic human ingenuity and intellect and drive, inventiveness, and ultimately incentive to lead a better life, to be able to have time to sit and dream dreams, draw pictures, look out the window, compose music, jump into bed with somebody, all those sorts of things that, human beings love to do, rather than back-breaking work just to feed themselves. So a combination of all of that leads me to be confident, Christina, that this transition will occur. And in fact, to be frank, is occurring.
So I have a question about economic incentives, and I mean, this is your area. This is where you shine. We've seen some attempts at economic incentives like carbon taxes.
Yeah.
And look, those have met with limited, if any, success. Where how do we convince governments to impose them when people, producers and consumers don't like them? Are there other economic incentives you can think of? Just, the economic political situation. How do we change that from being carbon connected?
Yeah.
And the status quo is often hard to move from.
Yeah.
Towards the innovation.
Yeah. That is clearly true, right? And yet we make these transitions. So thinking in Australia, for example, these matters are up for discussion now because of the pandemic. So one insight to this is, as Paul Keating used to say, you never let a good crisis go to waste. These are the opportunities when people will consider things they would not normally entertain, right? Or even exercise any intellectual power to think about it. We got the GST. Now, admittedly, it wasn't within the context of a dramatic event such as the pandemic, but it was clear that we needed to change the way the tax system was structured. And there was careful argument over a lengthy time convincing people that moving from one tax to another type of tax, right, was a sensible thing to do. And importantly, that people in the most vulnerable circumstances would be compensated for this. So in the broad, there'd be taxes that you'd save, alongside taxes that you'd pay. And that people who really were incapable, whose living standard would fall dramatically as a result of this for various reasons, they'd be looked after. And then, of course, as you know, in this context, in this country, probably ill-advisedly, but nevertheless, it happened. Food was excised, health was excised, education was excised, and we went from there. We might have to go back that way yet, but that's another story. So these opportunities arise. In the current context of the pandemic, for instance, we may see as a result of this pandemic the introduction of road congestion charges. which economists have talked about for years and years. Right? And environmentalists, of course, they're right with us on this. This is a tax on carbon. Right? And at the moment, electric vehicles aren't taxed at all because they don't use any fuel. And the only way we generate any sort of tax on motive power is through the diesel excise and fuel excise taxes. So you have to have a vehicle which is burning fossil fuels. Right? Well, people wouldn't do it because they would argue that this is unfair. I have no alternative but to be at work, trying to get to work by 7:30 in the morning on the freeway, right? And you're going to charge me for this. Now we have a situation where people say, well, actually, you don't have to do that. I want to put this charge on to induce you not to be driving at a time when there's a lot of traffic on the road, right? And you know what? You do have a choice. You can avoid this tax by spending the first couple of hours on the internet at home or not coming into work at all, right? All of those things are now open to you that you wouldn't have thought of before. So in those circumstances, people think, oh, okay. And then you say something like, and the purpose for raising this tax is to not just meet debts we might now have been incurring, but some of this tax we're going to use to invest in, I don't know, electric vehicles or some other sort of fossil fuel reduction program of some sort. Okay, that's what we're going to do with the money. We're not just going to spend it on anything else, right? That's what it's going to be dedicated for. People can see that they have a choice. They're not boxed in. They can see how the money might be spent. You begin to break down some of the barriers that people have to these types of programs. But Christina, you are right. None of this is easy, right? On the other hand, we changed the tariff regime in this country, which people were wedded to for nearly 70 years. We introduced the GST. We're running down the path now of having to think more seriously about property taxes, congestion charges, alternatives. At the grandest level, the International Monetary Fund has calculated that a carbon tax of $75 a tonne would effectively, right, incentivize the reduction of carbon production right across consumption and production in the world to meet the Paris targets, right? And $75 a tonne, obviously, for a country like Australia, that would be quite an impost, right? For other countries, not. So to get that up, you do have to think about what sort of transfers would occur internationally, and that can be difficult, and what you could do domestically to try to reduce the impact of a tax like that on the most vulnerable. But if at the end of the day you say, it's raising taxes like that, the money just doesn't go into the government's coffers. It's actually used to facilitate the type of innovation and scientific research effort that we need, then, people think differently about these things. So I think that at the end, the hope in this for an economist is that the problem, as I understand it, and I take my scientific colleagues' word for this, it's not a technical problem. Right? The problem is actually a politico-economic policy problem. Right? Well, we've got a lot of form on that front. Right? It does take time, and that's where people might say, yeah, well, it's all very well, but how long are you going to take to get all this done? And that then, in turn, depends upon the sense of urgency that people can give, and also the sense of hope. That's if you tell people, well, there really isn't any point, we're all going to fry anyway. Well, you just go home now. Because those all forget it. In that case, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That isn't the message. The message is, no, we do need to do something, but we can do something. One other nice little illustration, Christina, people might be interested in a magazine called Finance and Development, which is the magazine that the International Monetary Fund produces. They had a special issue late last year on climate change, and if anyone's interested in that, I would refer them to that issue of Finance and Development. You can find it on the internet easily enough, the December 2019 issue of Finance and Development. Anyway, apart from talking about carbon taxes and what you'd expect economists to talk about, there was one article, and all the scientific references are there if you want to follow it up, that talked about whales, right? And this is all news to me, okay? And it has an economic sort of end to it. But the point was that apparently whales sequester a great deal of carbon in their own bodies and their skeletons, right? And so that's the primary mechanism and they sequester a lot more than trees do. But the really powerful thing is what they call the whale pump. Apparently, the whales go to the bottom of the sea, right? they flush up, they take up nutrients and so forth from the bottom of the sea. They go to the top, they excrete, after they've digested it, and the whale excreta attract plankton. The plankton feed on the whale excreta, and the plankton, right, absorb carbon from the atmosphere, and they then fall to the bottom of the sea. So the calculations, again, you can find the references in the article, point out that one whale over its lifetime, because they live quite a long while, can sequester more carbon than a forest of 1.4 million trees. And the bottom line, allow the whale population in the world's oceans to return to its historic level. Now, apparently there's about a quarter of the whales that there ever were, based upon estimates, right? And even though we're protecting them and the numbers are going up again, the reality is that they get caught up in fishing nets, they get run into by large ships and that type of thing. So you can increase the whale population to say back up to where it was, right? That starts this whale pump and sequestering of carbon much more efficiently than growing trees. And I'm just reading this article, right? And so where does the economics come in? Well, there are shipping companies and fishing companies whose livelihoods will be affected. The ships will have to travel different routes, right? And the fishing companies will have to use different sorts of nets. So there comes in the question of how you compensate them, how you introduce international agreements. And you're back again into the world of international agreements and so forth, and they're difficult. But we did it with chlorofluorocarbons. And with something, we already have an international agreement on protecting whales with one or two notable exceptions. But if we're now protecting whales because of their impact on decarbonising the atmosphere, that's a whole different reason, right, to protect whales. Anyway, it's just to the point that the world seems to be full of these interesting examples that our scientific friends dig up, right, as they do their scientific research, and reinforcing the notion that this is it's not technically insoluble to decarbonise. The hard part is the politico-economic mechanism. And there, what I can say is, one, we understand that incentives work. Two, it takes quite a bit of effort, yes, to get the politico-economics on side, but it can be done just through careful mechanisms, careful discussions, which are ongoing as we speak. That, together with a force of incentive on the other side, where people, you're saying to people, well, people innately they know the answer is not to go backwards. They know that. You say, no, we're not. You don't have to do that. That's not my counsel. The counsel is not to go back to the Middle Ages, right? The counsel is to use these mechanisms that we have to switch consumption and production, right? And if we do that collectively, we can produce this outcome probably much faster than people would have thought.
Well, there you have it. What a great interview. Now, I believe Christina and Ian are both sitting in the waiting room. So I'm going to let Christina and Ian into our Zoom meeting, which is being streamed onto YouTube. There they are. Ian and Christina, thank you for joining us. I don't know if you've just listened to the interview yet again, but we've just listened to that great interview. And now I'm going to hand over to you, Christina, to field questions or to ask questions of your own. And I'll turn off my video so I get out of the way, I think. Over to you, Christina.
Well, it's lovely to see you again, Ian. How have you been?
Very well, thank you, Christina. Nice to see you too.
Great. So I didn't listen to the interview again that we recorded.
Once was enough.
But I did keep an eye on some of the questions and some of the comments that people were making in chat. And so I thought, I thought I'd start with one of the comments and see if you had a counter comment. So someone sort of just popped up with a comment, well, global warming is actually about CO2 in the atmosphere and not about economics. Do you have a counter comment?
Well, global warming is indeed about CO2 in the atmosphere, unless you think that economics has got nothing to do with producing CO2 in the atmosphere, then you have to think about what economics has to say about that. So, if you have the view that the global warming is simply the result of some natural process, and there are some who believe that it's not anthropogenic in any way, then of course you'd say, well, it's nothing to do with economics. It's all about geology or sunspots. But some people, most people recognize there's a link between the production of CO2 and its impact on global warming and economic activity. And that comes because of the energy intensity of the economy, as we were discussing, Christina. And in turn, the energy intensity of economic activity is primarily the result of burning fossil fuels.
And so this brings me to another comment in the chat that, well, the technology to bring the CO2 out of the atmosphere or to move away from a fossil fueled economy exists. But the comment, and I admit my own confusion about that, was that technology is illegal in Australia. Do you have?
I don't follow that. Depends which technology they're talking about. If they're talking about using uranium to generate electricity,
perhaps.
Well, then yes, that is illegal, right? That's not the only form of energy production which doesn't involve the burning of fossil fuels, but it is clearly one form of energy production that is completely free of burning fossil fuels and therefore producing CO2. Has other issues, but not that one.
Fair point. Now, I think as I was thinking about this over the last couple of days since we had our chat, we were talking about the technologies to bring carbon out of the atmosphere and to decouple our energy intense economy from carbon and bring it to other things. And that, if the technology exists, is a socio-political economic process. But your own comment, to my memory, was that it would take time to change the situation, to decouple our economy from carbon. And I was thinking that many of the concerns around global warming are that we don't have much time left. As the climate models are predicting, we've already seen an increase in global temperature. And, there is some argument that some of the efforts that we've made to change that, to change the economic and political situation, have gone backwards rather than moved forwards towards those technologies. How do you feel that we can actually have hope that there will be a solution in time to prevent some of the worst outcomes predicted by climate change modeling?
I think there are two answers to that one, Christina. The first is that there's a capacity to adapt that has been the basis upon which human beings have coped with climate change in the past. It's not as if climate change has never occurred before. Now, it might not necessarily be the result of human intervention, and certainly, depending if you go back far enough, it wouldn't be the result of human intervention. It would be part of a natural process. But human beings have had to adapt, including Indigenous Australians, of course, who moved, basically, as the sea levels rose and changed their lifestyles where they lived and changed their activities. Human beings have been doing that down the ages. So there is the capacity for adaptation, as people might have been reading in the last few days, excerpts of a recent book by Michael Schellenberger dealing with some of these issues. And amongst many examples, Schellenberger points out how the residents of the Netherlands, the Dutch, have dealt with increases in sea level over the years, extending way before modern climate change issues, essentially by developing dikes and pumps and other mechanisms. In some places in the Netherlands, the land that they use is 7 meters below the sea level. This is all speaks to a capacity for human adaptation. Now, adaptation wouldn't be any good to you if you're dealing with a very sudden change. But even on the IPCC predictions, there's, if we really made quite significant changes, then there would be the capacity to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade by the year 2050. Now that's going to require significant change. And I imagine most people would say, well, I don't know how likely that is. If you then run out to 2100, you'll see the potential for it to rise, say, to 2 degrees C. And the implications of that for sea level rises, I can't quote the actual numbers to you, but it's all, under a meter, right? And then the impact of that in certain parts of the world, no doubt, will be devastating. Right? In other parts of the world, it won't make a lot of difference. In some parts of the world, the additional CO2 will turn land that wasn't arable into arable land. In other parts of the world, it will create desertification. There's those things, we think we can predict with some accuracy. But there aren't many people, unless you believe in the tipping point thing, and I'm not a scientist, maybe you have to assign some probability to that. But most discussions, including the IPCC discussions, talk about the need to adapt to significant changes over the length of nearly a century. So over that period of time, Christina, the capacity for us to adapt and change the way we do things is really quite extraordinary. If you think about, if you try to compare where we are today, for example, with the world of 1920, on just about any dimension that you care to mention, you'll see that the world is a very, very different place. So I think my answer to you is, first and foremost, you've got a lot of time on your hands here generally, right? Secondly, the capacity for adaptation is significant, and we've not really tried that to the extent to which we need to do it. And thirdly, I suppose adaptation is something which is more likely to get, it's more likely that people will adapt to this through economic incentives than suddenly uproot everything that they do. That is much harder to achieve with economic incentives.
So I wanted to also ask, how does your faith, your Christian faith, impact your career as a prominent economist?
No.
And also your approach to considering these problems and the impact that they have or might have on our future?
Yeah, okay. Well, as an economist, the verse for me is Jeremiah 29:7, right? That you should pray for the welfare of the city and seek the welfare of the city. Pray for the city and seek its welfare, because in its welfare you will find your welfare, says God through the prophet Jeremiah to the Israelites. And looking at the welfare of the city, if you like, of the material conditions of human beings, is what economists do. So the message that I take from that is that you can actually actively seek the welfare of the city, and you can seek the welfare of the city in much the same way as medical practitioners seek the welfare of individuals. We can apply God-given reason and evidence and logic to thinking about how we can change these circumstances, whether it's curing disease or whether it's adapting to climate change or whether it's changing the way we generate energy in order to support our economic activities. Those things seem to be completely consistent with, a scientific, or if you like, using one's God-given gifts of reason in order to be able to achieve that. The second thing to point out is that, and as a Christian, I believe that at the end of the day, God's in control here, right? And he has a plan to prosper us, not to destroy us. And that I think if it is the case that, the Lord comes with his angel train between now and 2100, well, as far as Christians are concerned, you'd say, come Lord Jesus. The sooner the better. But that doesn't give me a counsel to suggest, therefore, you just shrug your shoulders and you sit and wait. Paul was quite clear in his message to the Thessalonians that that wasn't what you should be doing. And Christians down the ages, whatever the issue is, because we believe one, in a God who's in control. Two, we believe in a heaven and the ability and the capacity for us to be with God in heaven. But those things have never led Christians simply to sit down and say, well, come what may, we're okay, and the rest can just go, literally to hell. Christians have sought to be very active in all sorts of ways in trying to improve the lives of people here and now. So as a Christian economist, my particular calling is in the area of policy design and helping people think through ways in which we could change the way we organize ourselves economically to produce better outcomes. And that includes policies which would help to ameliorate the impact of too much carbon on the atmosphere, generating a global warming. That's part of what we do. It's therefore, it's remediable. It's able to be ameliorated. And my Christian faith gives me faith in the capacity of human beings to actually, apply reason and logic to dealing with issues like that. Put it this way, Christina, as we said the other day in the discussion, it takes more faith, I think, to believe the opposite of that than it does to believe that that's actually going to be effective for improving people's conditions.
So here's a tricky question coming from the chat again. Do you reckon that if our political cycle was about 20 years rather than only 3, would our rate of economic incentives for decarbonisation improve? See an uptick?
It is a tricky question because, of course, there are places on this planet who don't have elections at all, right? And there are public officials who basically seek to change the constitution so that they can be in power for very, very long periods of time. Right? You'd need to ask whether you think places where those things are true have a more enlightened approach to managing climate change than democracies like ours, which have a very quick cycle for electoral re-election. I don't know that you can draw a straight line between those outcomes. So the sort of what's behind the question is a sensible observation that the short-term political cycle lends itself towards short-term thinking and militates against taking a longer view. Now that there is something in that, right? But in the state of Victoria, for example, we have 5-year cycles. The UK has 5-year cycles. Right? The United States elects its president every 4 years. So there are plenty of examples of places that have electoral cycles that are longer than ours. Are they all uniformly, or nationally in our case, are they uniformly more, long-sighted than places with a 3-year cycle? Even if they were, Christina, lots of things are at play here. And if you deliberately lengthen the electoral cycle with a view to trying to get longer-term decision-making, you're right up against the you're right up against the self-interest of politicians and their capacity to turn those lengthy periods of time to their own advantage rather than to the advantage of the community. One of the reasons that we keep electoral cycles short is that it's actually very good to keep turning over the political leadership so that nobody gets the idea that they're in there for too long and therefore can make arrangements to suit themselves rather than the people. So, it's a mixed bag. So one, I don't think there's very strong evidence that lengthening political cycles has given rise to more enlightened environmental policy. And secondly, there are other issues to be considered when you start deciding that, democracy is not a very reliable thing and we should be switching it off, or at least lengthening the time between elections.
Now we have time for one last question before we need to wrap up. Also from the chat, someone asked, we still have to make choices on how to spend. And how will these choices be made? He says, the work of economist Bjorn Lomborg, for example, suggests that there are some more pressing problems. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, well, he's not alone in thinking that, right? And, people have already made comparisons between the number of people who have already died from the COVID-19 pandemic relative to those that you could literally point to as having died from climate change. And if you want to point to ways in which you could improve people's lives now and into the future, including the next generation, so not just looking after those who happen to be here now, then there are a range of things. The traditional development goals, to be frank, right, that you would look to, which comes back to the earlier question you were asking, Christina, is if there's a longer term horizon here, we've got time to adapt, right? There are, and it's not clear that allowing the climate to warm over that period of time is an unmitigated disaster. There are pluses and minuses, right? And people indicate, for instance, that, and this is IPCC numbers, that if you just let it rip, so to speak, then there would be a cost to GDP. I think the numbers are something like about, reducing global GDP by 6% or something. Now, there are plenty of things that can reduce global GDP by more than that, including pandemics, right? And there are other ways in which you could mitigate the impact of climate change to recover some of that lost output. So I'm not suggesting that we just do nothing about it, because of course there are scenarios to do with tipping points, as people point out, that could make the whole thing less stable. But when it comes to the priorities that governments and individuals would place on different policies, then the person who asks the question is quite right. This isn't the only game in town. Even if your narrow focus is just looking after the impact of current policies on people's lives here and now, then there are other things that you could usefully be thinking about. That's true.
Well, thank you very much, Ian and Christina. Thank you for bearing with my technical faux pas at the beginning of the session. Thank you everyone for your patience. We will try to make sure that doesn't happen again. That was a very interesting conversation. And for those that are listening, perhaps if you missed the beginning, the recording will be up on YouTube. And of course, I have to advertise COSAC. Do sign up for COSAC if you haven't signed up already. We have about 50 speakers. And yes, you will get a chance to hear all of those people at some stage because excuse me, because their talks will be available after COSAC. So COSAC starts this weekend at 7 o'clock on Friday night. Although on Wednesday night at 7:30, we have another free public interview with Sally Shaw. I won't tell you more about that. You can read about that on the website. So thank you, Christina. Thank you, Ian.
Okay.
And thank you to our listeners. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Good night.